Julian Assange is paying the price for taking on the high and mighty, revealing uncomfortable truths. It often comes at a cost, especially when people in positions of power are exposed. Whistleblowers always run the risk of facing a crackdown. So do journalists who expose uncomfortable truths. And that's what makes it both challenging and dangerous. 50 years ago today, an expose brought down a president. A burglary was foiled in Washington, D.C. Months later, it took down the presidency of Richard Nixon. It has been 50 years since the Watergate scandal came to light, but it still remains part of popular culture. The word gate has become synonymous with any scandal or controversy. That was the impact of the Watergate revelations. So what was the scandal all about? Our next report tells you.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
I am not a crook.
I made my mistakes.
Those words would come back to haunt Richard Nixon. Words that would define his legacy. Words that every American who watched the Nixon presidency implode would remember. Because less than a year after Nixon said those words, he would resign in humiliation.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Richard Nixon could have been one of the defining presidents of America, but his legacy was undone by a scandal. One that took down his presidency. It all began here, the Watergate building. A break-in went wrong in 1972. 5 men were caught red-handed at the offices of the Democratic National Committee. They were not your usual burglars. 4 of them worked for the CIA. The 5th burglar worked with the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon. The failed op was an attempt to mount a snooping operation. The burglars were there to plant listening devices. Nixon's aides were on the hunt for damaging information about his political rivals. The failed Watergate burglary was just the tip of the iceberg. In the months that followed, several more operations came to light. Nixon's operatives engaged in a whole bevy of criminal activity. They followed family members of Democratic candidates. They forged letters to embarrass Democrats. They leaked false information to the press. Even Democratic campaign workers were spared. Dozens of them were investigated by federal agencies. Nixon's aides went after several strong Democratic candidates. They ended their bids for presidency through sabotage. Initially, they got away with all of this. Richard Nixon was re-elected in 1972. The campaigns of his rivals flopped. He faced no serious challenges, but the crimes caught up with Nixon and his team. Leading American newspapers investigated the Nixon campaign relentlessly. They reported on how campaign donations were used to sabotage the Democrats.
Now, during the actual election campaign, were you then saying that the White House was involved? How soon did you begin to suspect that people right at the top were involved?
I would say it was just about a month before the election we wrote our big story saying that the Watergate bugging was just one act in a very elaborate campaign of political spying and sabotage, and that as many as 50 people were working on this, that it was directed and sponsored from the White House.
Ultimately, it was the tapes from the White House that drove the final nail in the coffin. Nixon had a habit of recording his daily activities and interactions. He had an audio recorder in the Oval Office. Just before the election, Nixon discussed the Watergate break-in with his aides on several occasions.
They'll call them in and say, we've gotten the signal across the river to put the hold on this. And that'll fit rather well because the FBI agents who are working the case at this point feel that's what it is the CIA. But they're tracing the money to, well, they've traced it to a name that they haven't got to the guy yet.
These tapes were the smoking gun. They proved how Nixon and his aides actively tried to block a probe into the scandal. Soon after the tapes went public, Nixon quit. The Watergate scandal has been described as the political crime of the century. It didn't just prematurely end a president's term, it shattered America's faith in its politicians.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.